Was standing at the kitchen counter when my daughter told me I needed to sign the papers or get out of my own house. Not asked, told. She set the folder down on the granite countertop, the same countertop I'd installed myself 23 years ago when her mother and I renovated this kitchen together, and she slid it toward me like she was closing a business deal. Her husband stood behind her with his arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe, not saying a word. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. I picked up the folder. I read the first page. Then I set it back down. "I need some time," I said. My daughter looked at her husband. He looked back at her. Something passed between them. Something I'd been noticing for months, but kept telling myself I was imagining. "Dad," she said, in that voice she'd been using lately. Patient. Slow. Like she was talking to someone who was losing their grip. "We've been over this. The joint ownership arrangement is the simplest solution. It protects you." I almost laughed. I didn't. I just nodded and said I'd think about it. And I watched them leave the kitchen, and I stood there alone next to that granite countertop and felt something cold settle into my chest. That was a Tuesday in late October. The maples in the backyard had gone full red. I remember because I kept staring out the window at them while I tried to figure out when exactly my life had started slipping out of my hands. My name is Douglas. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Edmonton, and I retired at 62 with a full pension, a paid-off house in a good neighborhood, and what I genuinely believed was a solid relationship with my only child. My wife, Carolyn, died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about those 14 weeks much. There aren't words for them. What I will say is that losing her changed the geometry of everything. The house felt different. The mornings felt different. Even the way sunlight came through the windows felt like it belonged to someone else's life. My daughter had just gotten married the year before Carolyn was diagnosed. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's the only title I ever gave him that meant anything, was a man I'd had reservations about from the beginning. Not dramatic reservations, just the quiet kind that live in your gut. He was charming in the way that people who need something from you tend to be charming. He remembered details. He asked good questions. He made you feel seen right up until the moment you realized he'd been taking notes the whole time. When Carolyn died, my daughter called every day for 3 months. Then every other day, then once a week. I understood. She had her own grief. She had her own life. I wasn't keeping score. But then came the suggestion. Gentle at first, the way all these things start out, gentle. "Dad, that house is too big for one person. Dad, you shouldn't be shoveling that driveway yourself. Dad, what happens if something goes wrong and no one's there?" I told her I was fine. I told her I had neighbors I'd known for 15 years. I told her that the house wasn't too big. It was exactly the right size because it was my home and I knew every room in it and every room in it held something of Carolyn's, and I wasn't ready to give any of that up. Then came the proposal, and this time it wasn't gentle at all, even though the words were. They wanted to move in, temporarily. They were in a transitional period, my daughter explained. Her husband's business, he'd been running some kind of consulting firm that I never quite understood, despite multiple explanations, had hit a rough patch. They needed to recalibrate. 3 months, maybe 4. They'd cover their own expenses. They'd help around the house. It would be good for all of them, she said. It would be good for me. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. The first month was almost pleasant. My daughter cooked on weekends. My son-in-law fixed the gutter on the north side that I'd been putting off. They were careful with their noise in the mornings because they knew I woke up early. It felt almost like family, but I started noticing things, small things at first. My son-in-law asking questions about the house, not curious questions, inventory questions. How old was the furnace? When was the roof last replaced? What did I think the property was worth now, compared to when I'd bought it? He framed everything as practical interest, the way a man might frame it if he were helping his father-in-law plan for the future. I answered honestly because I didn't yet understand the shape of what was happening. Then he started talking about the market. Edmonton real estate, he said, was going to soften. Interest rates, economic uncertainty, the usual pressures. He knew someone. He was always knowing someone. A financial advisor who specialized in asset protection for retirees. Had I thought about restructuring how I held the property? A joint tenancy arrangement, for instance, with right of survivorship, would mean the house passed directly without going through probate. Simpler, faster, better for everyone in the long run. I told him I already had a will. He nodded, like I'd said something endearing. 3 months became 5, 5 became 8. I stopped asking about their timeline because every time I raised it, my daughter's eyes would fill with a particular kind of hurt. Not real hurt, I understood later, but performed hurt, carefully calibrated, and I would feel like a bad father for asking. So I stopped asking. I stopped asking about a lot of things. My son-in-law's consulting firm, as far as I could tell, was not recovering. He spent most days in the basement office. They'd converted from what used to be my workshop. On calls I could never quite hear through the floor. He was always busy. He was never, as far as I could see, earning anything. My daughter had stopped working the year before. Indefinitely, she said. She was figuring things out. I was paying for the groceries without making a point of it. I was covering the utilities. I told myself this was what family did. Carolyn would have done the same, I thought. But Carolyn also would have noticed sooner than I did. The folder appeared 8 months in. That first time with the kitchen counter, I called my friend Bernard. We'd worked together at the city for 20 years, and I described the document to him over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. "Douglas," he said, "you need to talk to a lawyer." I told him I was probably overreacting. "You're not," he said. "I've seen this. Not exactly this, but the shape of it. Call someone." I didn't call anyone that week. I told myself I was giving my daughter the benefit of the doubt. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation, and I just hadn't heard it yet. Then I found the brochure. It was tucked into a stack of mail on the front hall table, probably slipped there by accident because it was addressed to my son-in-law, and it had been opened. He was from a property management company. It was describing their services for landlords who wanted to list residential properties for rent. Someone had circled a paragraph about market rental rates in my neighborhood with a blue pen. I put it back where I found it. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, the side I'd slept on for 30 years, the right side, because Carolyn had always taken the left. And I sat there for a long time without moving. I thought about the gutters my son-in-law had fixed. I thought about the charming questions. I thought about the folder on the countertop. And then I thought about Bernard, and I picked up my phone. And this time I dialed the number he'd given me. The lawyer's name was Patricia Webb. She was in her 50s, direct in a way I appreciated, and she did not soften what she told me. The documents my son-in-law had been pressing me to sign would have transferred a joint ownership interest in my property to my daughter in Alberta with right of survivorship attached. This meant that if I died, the house went to her automatically, outside my will, outside my estate, outside anyone else's claim. More immediately, it meant that as a joint owner, she would have had the legal standing to take certain actions regarding the property that I might not have agreed to. Like renting it out, for instance. Patricia told me what I needed to do. She was clear and methodical about it. I took notes on the back of an envelope because I hadn't brought paper, and she watched me write and didn't rush me. I left her office on a grey November afternoon and drove home. I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for 10 minutes looking at the house. The house I had bought with Carolyn in 1991. The house where my daughter had grown up. The house where we had put up a Christmas tree every year for 22 years in the same corner of the living room, because Carolyn said the light hit it best there. I thought about who my daughter had been when she was 8 years old, chasing the dog around the backyard, leaving her library books on every horizontal surface she passed, crying at the end of every school year because she'd miss her teacher. I didn't recognize the woman inside my house in that 8-year-old girl. And that particular grief was the kind I hadn't prepared for. I did not sign the documents. Instead, over the following 3 weeks, I did what Patricia had advised. I contacted my bank and added additional verification requirements to my accounts. I updated my will with a different executor, not my daughter. I spoke to an independent financial advisor, a man named Roger, who came recommended through my pension provider and who had no connection to anyone in my life, and I restructured how my assets were held in a way that made unilateral action by any joint party considerably more complicated. I also did something else, something smaller maybe, but it mattered. I bought a doorbell camera and 3 indoor security cameras, and I installed them myself over a Saturday afternoon, the way I used to install things in this house, methodically with the right tools without asking anyone for help. I told no one. My daughter noticed the doorbell camera. She mentioned it at dinner, casually, said it was probably a good idea given the neighborhood. Her husband said nothing and looked at his plate. 3 days later, a Sunday morning, I came downstairs to find them at the kitchen table with the folder again. It had new pages added. My son-in-law explained that they'd had a lawyer review the arrangement. A lawyer of their choosing, he did not mention, and that everything was completely standard. He used the word standard 4 times in 4 minutes. I counted. I looked at my daughter. I asked her if this was what she wanted. She said, "Dad, we're doing this for you." I asked her very quietly what exactly she thought she was doing for me. She said I was being paranoid. She said grief did things to people and it was completely understandable, but I needed to trust them. I stood up. I told them I wouldn't be signing anything. I told them as calmly as I could manage that I needed them to find alternative accommodations within 60 days, and that I was happy to help them with first and last month's rent somewhere appropriate. My son-in-law's face changed. It happened fast, there and then gone, like a light switched off and back on. But I saw it. My daughter looked at him. He looked at the table. "You're making a mistake," he said. I told him I'd made mistakes before and survived them. They didn't leave at 60 days. On day 62, my son-in-law met me at the bottom of the stairs as I was coming down with a basket of laundry. I have always done my own laundry. Carolyn used to tease me about it, and he blocked my path. Not aggressively, just there in the way. Close enough that I had to stop. He told me that they had consulted with another lawyer and that I should be aware that a joint family member in residence for an extended period had certain rights under provincial tenancy considerations, and I should think very carefully before escalating this into something formal. I looked at him. I said I had already thought carefully about it. He stepped aside. I walked past him to the laundry room. That night, I called Patricia again. She told me what I needed to know about occupant rights versus tenancy rights in Alberta, and she told me to document everything, and she told me to make sure my camera footage was being saved to the cloud and not just to a local drive in the house. "Why?" I asked. I asked because if the drive is in the house, she said, they can interfere with it. I sat with that for a moment. I thanked her and hung up and changed my camera storage to cloud backup that same evening. My son-in-law made his real move on a Thursday in December. I was in the backyard. There is a bench out there under the old spruce tree where I sometimes sit in the cold with a coffee just because the quiet is different outside. When I heard my daughter's voice through the kitchen window speaking to someone on the phone, I wasn't trying to listen, but the window was cracked and voices carry in winter air the way they don't in summer. She was talking to someone about a listing, about square footage and parking and rental income. She was talking about a timeline. She used the phrase, "once the estate transfer is complete." I am 68 years old, and I have not cried in front of another person since Carolyn's funeral. I didn't cry then, either. I sat on my bench under the spruce tree, and I held my coffee with both hands, and I felt something very old and very final close inside me. I wasn't angry. I want to be honest about that, because anger would have been easier. What I felt was more like the moment after a car accident. That strange suspended clarity where everything slows down and you see exactly what happened, and your body hasn't yet decided what to do about it. I finished my coffee. I went inside. I said nothing. That evening, I called Bernard. "It's time," I said. He knew what I meant. The next morning, I sent a formal notice through Patricia's office. 60 days to vacate, documented, delivered by registered mail and email simultaneously. I also submitted the camera footage from the previous 30 days to Patricia for her review, including the timestamps from the Sunday morning at the kitchen table and 3 separate incidents I had documented of my son-in-law accessing my home office without permission. Patricia said she had enough. I also made one other call, to my daughter's husband's business partner, a man I'd met twice at family dinners, who had once mentioned to me that the consulting firm's incorporation documents listed both their names. I didn't make any accusations. I simply asked in the way that retired engineers sometimes ask things, a few methodical questions about the current status of the business, and whether certain recent actions had been discussed between the partners. The silence on the other end of the phone told me more than anything he eventually said. My daughter called me the night the notice arrived. She was crying. Real crying this time. I know the difference. I raised her. I know every register of her voice. And that was harder than anything else. She said she didn't understand. She said she just wanted to help. She said her husband had assured her that everything they'd been doing was legal and normal, and in my best interest. I asked her if she had read the documents, the ones she'd brought to my kitchen 3 times. She was quiet. I asked her if she had understood what signing them would have meant. She said her husband had explained it to her. I told her that was not the same thing as understanding it herself, and that she might want to speak to her own lawyer, not the one her husband found, before the next step of this process. She cried for another few minutes. I let her. I didn't rush her. Then I told her I loved her and I always would, and I hung up the phone. I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. The red digital clock on the stove said 11:47. Carolyn had wanted a different clock, one with a softer light, but we'd never gotten around to replacing it. Some things you just live with. The formal process took 4 months. My son-in-law did consult another lawyer, and there was a period of letters exchanged and positions stated, and Patricia doing what Patricia did with thorough and unhurried competence. In the end, there was no legal ground for them to stand on. The property was mine. The documents had never been signed. The camera footage established a pattern that no one wanted fully examined in a formal proceeding. They moved out on a wet Tuesday in April. My son-in-law carried boxes to a rental truck without looking at me. My daughter hugged me at the door briefly, and I hugged her back. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know," I said, and I think I did believe that. I'm still working out how much to believe it. I had the locks rekeyed that same afternoon. I moved through the house, room by room, the way you check a house when you come back from a long time away. Everything was where I'd left it. My workshop in the basement was somewhat rearranged, but nothing was missing. My filing cabinet, which I had locked 8 months before and never mentioned to anyone, was undisturbed. I made dinner, nothing elaborate, scrambled eggs, toast, tea. I sat at the kitchen table and ate alone and looked at the granite countertop and the window with the backyard beyond it. The spruce tree was just starting to go green at the tips. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about Carolyn, the way I do every evening, the way I will probably do every evening for whatever evenings I have left. I thought about my daughter, and the long, uncertain road of whatever comes next between us. I thought about the 8-year-old girl with the library books, and whether she was still in there somewhere, and whether any of this was retrievable. I don't have tidy answers to those questions. Anyone who tells you that a story like this ends cleanly is either lying or has never lived one. What I have is this: my house, my name on the title, my workshop back in the basement, Carolyn's Christmas tree corner in the living room, still waiting for December. Bernard came over for dinner the following Saturday, and I made the beef stew that Carolyn used to make, the one with the dark beer in it, and we talked about everything and nothing for 3 hours, and he did not once ask me how I was doing, because he already knew. That's what 60 years earns you if you're lucky. People who already know. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in my house in Edmonton. I have a pension and a good lawyer and cloud-backed security cameras and a bench under a spruce tree where I drink my coffee in the cold. I don't know what my daughter and I will become on the other side of this. I hope for something. I'm not counting on it. What I know is that I spent 31 years solving structural problems, figuring out how much load a thing could bear before it failed. And I understand, finally, that the same principles apply to family as to everything else. You can love someone and still refuse to let them take your foundation out from under you. That's the thing I wish I'd said to my daughter at the door. Instead, I just held on a moment longer than I needed to, and then I let her go. I keep coming back to the brochure. That folded piece of paper with my address circled in blue pen, sitting in a stack of mail like it was nothing. Like it had already been decided. There's a version of this story where I never find it, where I sign the documents because she's my daughter, and I trust her, and that's what fathers do. I thought about that version a lot. It doesn't take long to see how it ends. What I've come to understand, not comfortably, not quickly, is that what happened in my house over those 8 months wasn't just a legal problem. It was a failure of character. Not only theirs. Mine too in the beginning. I wanted so badly to believe that the people I loved were who I needed them to be that I kept explaining away things that didn't need explaining. I kept being generous with my trust long after trust had stopped being earned. That's not kindness. That's avoidance. And avoidance has a cost. My son-in-law was a man who had learned that charm was a tool. He used it carefully, the way you'd use a good knife, precisely at the right angle, never wasted. But a person who treats other people as problems to be managed will eventually run out of room to maneuver. Every calculation he made assumed I was slower than I was, less attentive, more sentimental than clear-headed. He mistook my patience for passivity and my grief for confusion. Those were expensive mistakes. And my daughter, I still don't know the full shape of her part in it. Maybe I never will. What I know is that she handed herself over to someone else's judgment and stopped using her own. That's a kind of surrender I recognize because I almost made it myself. In those months after Carolyn died, when the world felt too complicated to navigate alone. The difference is that I eventually asked for help from people who had nothing to gain from my answer. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. It's not that you become less capable. It's that the people around you start assuming you have. And if you're not paying attention, if you're grieving, if you're tired, if you just want someone to take a few things off your plate, that assumption can do a tremendous amount of damage before you even realize it's there. I'm not bitter about it. I want to be clear about that. Bitterness would mean I thought I deserved better from the universe. And I've lived long enough to know that the universe doesn't work on desert. What happens tends to follow from what we do. Not perfectly, not immediately, but the thread is usually there if you're willing to trace it back. I did the work. I made the calls. I sat with a lawyer I hadn't met before and told her the truth and wrote things down on the back of an envelope and changed my storage settings to the cloud on a Saturday night. None of that was heroic. It was just methodical. It was the same thing I did for 31 years. When a load-bearing calculation came back wrong, You don't panic. You go back to the numbers. You find where the error is, and you fix it. Bernard came for dinner last Saturday. We ate the stew and talked until the clock in the kitchen said 10:15. At some point, he asked me what I'd do differently if I could go back. I thought about it for a while. I'd have trusted my gut in month 2, I said, and I'd have called Patricia in month 1. He nodded. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The spruce tree in the backyard is fully green now. I had my coffee out there this morning in the early quiet, before the neighborhood woke up, and I sat on the bench and looked at the house and thought, that's mine. Every board and beam of it. Every room where something of Carolyn's still lives. Nobody gave that back to me. I held on to it myself.